And to me, the answer there was a free commercial sector, that was the really revolutionary moment. Um, which is another reason I think he would have been appalled by coronavirus lockdowns, because they were nothing if not an elite racket. It was just hid in their homes and protect themselves from the pathogen while using the working class and poor as their sandbags. Get out there, get infected, create herd immunity for me. Let me know when it's safe. That was the ethos, and it was a disgusting ascendance of ruling class values over the poor and working classes. Exactly as you expect with all forms of government planning.
Hi, welcome to And If Love Remains. I am your host, Mike Levitt, and I am with Jeffrey A. Tucker, who is an independent editorial consultant. He is the author of many thousands of articles in scholarly and popular press and 8 books in 5 languages, most recently Liberty or Lockdown. He is also the editor of The Best of Mises. He speaks widely on topics of economic, technology, social philosophy, and culture. And he's a good friend of the program. And I just thank you for being on, Jeffrey.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for thinking of me.
Oh, absolutely. Before we talk about the subject at hand, I want to just mention the great work that you've done this last year or so, as it pertains to the pandemic. I've been following your work, and the work of your colleagues, and it's you've taken a very, I'll say, humble approach to the virus itself, and yet you've been steadfast in the ideas of liberty and the ideas that personal choice and these kind of concepts, I think a lot of people in the liberty movement honestly kind of dropped the ball on this crisis that has happened, and I just want to congratulate you. Thank you for keeping me sane over the last year or so.
Yeah, a lot of people have said that there's this kind of a. I never really thought of myself as. I always thought of myself as just a writer, intellectual, But yeah, so many people have said to me that there's been a real psychological benefit to my writings on the topic, because it made them feel as if they weren't alone.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people had this feeling that something was very wrong with the world, but they didn't know what it was, or how public health policy should approach something like a pandemic. People have not really thought it through, and so they're kind of blindsided. I mean, this is sort of the way governments work. It's like, well, you can have your liberty and your rights most of the time, except now there's an actual terrible thing happening that nobody really expected. And, that can be anything, we can have liberty, except Soviet communism is threatening the world, but now it's terrorism.
Right.
And in the Middle Ages it was vampires and heresy, and there's always the big excuse for why we can't have normal lives, and this is all part of trying to keep the population in a kind of constant state of fear, so that they comply. And fear is a very interesting emotion, because it's typically focused. It's a lizard brain function of our thinking. It's like fear drives out rational risk assessment. It's so you just focus on one thing you're really scared of: nuclear war, communism, terrorism, witchcraft, the virus, and every other consideration just kind of goes by the wayside. And so it's irrational, but it's a feature of fear. And obviously, the population gets used to the fear of the day over time, and when people begin to suspect a racket, like, well, maybe Protestantism isn't so terrible, maybe the vampires aren't coming for me. Maybe the Soviet Union is not a global behemoth threatening our liberty, but is a decrepit, falling down old regime. And people gradually catch on. Iraq doesn't have weapons of mass destruction, and so people gradually catch on. So then, powerful people who want you to give up your liberties have to change the topic. So the issue of germs, in particular, and viruses, has been on the back burner now for about 15 years in terms of a possible deployment. It's been sitting there as a way to control the population, but it's not really been deployed. So all this nonsense began back in 2006, when the CDC first changed its guidelines from being traditional public health concerns, which is keep the population calm. If you get sick, go to your doctor. Continue life as normal, because the collateral damage of extreme measures is too high. And plus, those measures don't really work. We know from experience from 1918. We know they don't work. We know the mask mandates don't actually control the virus, and so on. So let's just, you know, um, do what we did in 1957, 58, and 68, 69, and 24, and 42, and so on. Uh, but in 2006, a new theory took over, which is that we can use the power of the state to manage the virus and control people, game the virus, cause the R naught to fall below one, flatten the curve, engage in targeted layered intervention and track and trace and all these things, and keep people apart.
Right.
That's a really important sort of core principle of this nonsense. And keeping people apart was a way of kind of getting people to comply with the modular mechanistic approach that had been doped out, some 15 years ago by a minority of fanatics, really, within the computer science industry and epidemiology. But over the course of 15 years, they just got sort of ever more lusty to try out their theories. And they had tried it in 2009, it didn't work, and then again in 2012 and 13 with SARS-CoV-1.
And when you say it didn't work, you're saying that the people didn't comply, like they didn't buy into it.
Well, there wasn't the conditions weren't right for whipping up the public fear enough.
Gotcha.
Because that was an H1N1, by the way, which is the same. It's a mutation of 1918, actually. So, it was a pretty darn scary. It turned out, the Obama administration dealt with it with just traditional public health measures, which is, again, keeping people calm and dealing with pathogens as if they're part of life. And but the big problem in 2009, and the reason why this didn't happen, is there are two considerations. One was that they hadn't yet taken over the epidemiological profession. But the second thing is that we're in the middle of a financial crisis and people were too distracted. So they couldn't deploy their schemes back then. So it had to wait, another 11 years before the right virus came along. And then finally all the pieces fell into place, whether it was the Gates funding or new innovations in mRNA technology. I think very critically for lockdowns is that there is a growing populist public revolt around the Western world, and the progressives really wanted to crush it. And the best way to crush something like that is to introduce kind of wild chaos. So that was a factor too. There were a lot of things that came together that caused these lockdowns. Then you mentioned about, like I wrote about SARS-CoV-2 for the first time in January of 2020 and warned that quarantines were a power that the state presumed to have, and that it was written in the disease plans of the CDC, and that it could happen, and people thought it was crazy. But sure enough, 3 months later, it happened, and then people just thought it was like, well, I guess this is what we do. No, it's not what we do. It's not what we do. And
Right. And the classic meme was, oh, it was just going to be 2 weeks, as you said, to flatten the curve, and people kind of bought into it because they thought it was just a temporary, a temporary thing that wasn't really going to affect their lives in a major way. But we're just okay. We all want to protect our neighbors and such, and it was such a benign setup and then the bait and switch happened.
Sure. That 15 days thing was a marketing ploy by Fauci and Birx to sell Trump on the idea, because they knew they couldn't uh, get him to shut down the country for a year. Certainly not all the way to the election, but they knew they could convince him that 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 he had the power to shut everything down for 2 weeks, and they figured they'd, you know, when the 2 weeks are up, it's mathematically impossible that you could suppress a virus in 2 weeks through human separation. It's ridiculous. They knew that. It doesn't work out. I mean, the math doesn't check out at all. Um, I mean, it's just not possible. So after, a couple weeks, they came to him and said, "Mr. President, you did a wonderful, wonderful, brave, bold thing when shutting everything down, but um, but now you need to continue it, because if you open everything up now, all the gains we've made, will be
Right.
lost." And so he's like, "Geez, okay." So he went along with another 2 weeks, and then another week, and then he started going on about how we're going to have a resurrection at Easter. But then he got scared that he couldn't do that. The big problem that the White House had at the time was that they had convinced Trump from as early as February or even late January that his goal should be to minimize cases. And so every new case was, he was told, was a failing of his administration. So he became the original sort of zero COVID person. He's like, okay, I can't have any cases. Well, that's a nice setup, uh,
Right.
because then every day he'd come along, they'd walk into his office and he'd say, how's the virus doing? Well, bad news. We found 14 new cases. Um, we're now up to 28. And he's like, "Oh no, this is terrible." So, so he saw that as his metric. And as a businessman, he was looking for a metric of success or failure. And the rise of cases to him was failure, and the falling of cases was success. Well, this is a perfect setup. At that point, there was nothing he couldn't work his way around that problem. Once he decided to suppress the virus, they had him where they wanted him.
Yeah.
And so he, at his own hands, betrayed every principle that he stood for, and he did it in the name of public health. And he could have resisted, but he didn't. He went along with it, and he didn't get wise to the scheme until about, it was late April, early May. He just stopped meeting with Burke and Fauci. And then he let a month go by where he just decided not to think about it, although it vexed him like crazy. And finally, it was as late as July, he was watching Fox News and he got a hold of this guy named Scott Atlas.
Uh-huh.
And Scott Atlas came along and shaped him up and made him realize central points about endemicity and herd immunity and, good principles of public health. And he was, I think at that point, I'm probably talking too much, but at that point, he um, realized that he had done terrible things. But then you have another problem, that Trump's famously unwilling to admit error. And
Right.
so instead of admitting the error, he just decided on his own to try to change the subject. So he just literally stopped talking about it between August and the election, with that brief interlude in which he actually got COVID, shook it off, and then I think that was the greatest moment of his presidency. He said, "We do not need to fear this virus. We need to treat it as a sickness and deal with it as individuals." And then he went on to say, "Wow, now that I've had it, I have immunities," which I just thought, thank God somebody's talking about natural immunity finally.
Right.
But it was an amazing mess. Um, Trump, is not a stupid man, very smart, very brave. I don't agree with a ton of his ideas. I think he's hugely problematic ideologically, but he got out uh, smarted. I mean, he was
Yeah.
outgunned and outwitted, and actually allowed himself to destroy his presidency. I mean, that's the reason he lost the election, was because of his handling of
Clearly.
the virus. And and then he dragged the House and Senate with him. And now we have a one-party state. So there you go. The plan worked.
It did. And the and economically, we're seeing such devastation. I just saw the new uh, uh, consumer price index is just rocketing because when you lock people down and then you just start increasing the debt in order to make people feel okay temporarily for being locked down. um, the inevitable, I mean, inflation just happened and now prices are going to increase, and somehow the virus, the actual virus has created a new economic virus, and that's kind of reshaping our world kind of as we see it. So we see a new set of crises happening. That's how I see it.
Yeah, and there's a little step in your narrative that's fairly interesting to consider. Um, on March 27th, so Trump gave his press conference on March 16th, in which, like, why anybody thought that was normal. My God, Burks got on national television and said, our main goal here is to keep everybody separate. Like, what does that mean, keep everybody separate? I mean, that's not that's a totalitarian vision. I mean, that's dismantling of fundamental structures of the way of life. I mean, that was an appalling comment, but it was accurate. That's what they wanted. um, Now, 2 weeks later, at that magic moment, um, there's two ways we could have gone. We could have just said, okay, that was, hope everybody enjoyed your Netflix binge watching, and let's all get back to work. The virus has got to become endemic. Let's just move on. But instead, Congress got in business, and they were like, okay, we've got to bail everybody out for what we just did to them. We've got to compensate everybody for this, for these forced closures, stay-at-home orders, and school lockdowns, and church closures, and all this stuff. So they proposed a $2.3 trillion spending bill. That was on March 27th. They were all huddled in their homes, trying to figure out, and they were going to pass this thing on a Zoom call. And Thomas Massey from Kentucky, one of the smartest guys in Congress,
For sure.
actually demanded a quorum, and infuriated his colleagues, and so everybody had to go to Washington. And Trump, lit into him and denounced him on Twitter and said, "This guy's evil, he's grandstander, he has to be kicked out of the Republican Party," and so on. But they all went there, and on a voice vote, and as far as Massey knows, he was the only voice of opposition. They
Yeah.
passed this $2.3 trillion spending bill. Now, what that did was, uh, it it gave money to the states for continuing the lockdown. So suddenly, the states had locked down, the governments had locked down their now. They're being flooded with a windfall of cash. So, what was the incentive to open up at that point? I mean, their tax base was collapsing. People were furious, but all the governments were experiencing unprecedented amounts of subsidies, and they're like, "Wow, these lockdowns are pretty good after all."
Absolutely.
Might as well continue. So it created what's called a moral hazard.
I was, and obviously this is incidental to our area, but I was shocked during this lockdown, how much public works were going, how many roads were being fixed, how many things were being done. I kept looking around every day, like more orange cones were going up everywhere. And I was thinking, where is all this happening? How are we in this complete crisis? And yet all I see is governments flushed with cash, and with no idea of how that's going to eventually be paid for.
Yeah, and we know how it happened. It was the Fed went in and bought, half the new
Yep,
debt,
that's right.
and that created, like, if you just look at the money supply data, it's absolutely shocking. These hockey sticks. We thought we had seen monetary expansion in the past, and we've never seen anything remotely like this. Now, it didn't generate inflation, at least initially, because you had a huge, at the same time, increase in the demand for cash balances. So the velocity of money collapsed, as what always happens in an economic crisis. Happened in 2008, happened in 1932 and 31.
Right.
So that puts a little bit of a break on the price response to monetary expansion. And then also, productivity just collapsed. So there wasn't anything really going on. Um, but there's a long and variable lags associated with monetary policy and the implications. And I don't know what that looks like going forward. The inflation we're having right now is in part monetary driven, but it's also structurally driven in the sense that, like, there's just a lot of things that have gone way up in price because of broken supply chains, shortages and stuff. So, sussing out which one is which is not going to be easy. But hey, the great thing about the unfolding of history is that we'll eventually know, and
Yeah.
we'll see what happens. But
Well,
whatever it
and
is, it's not going to be good.
and to transition a little bit into one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is coming up is the anniversary of the birthday of Lev von Mises, and he's a great. I love Mises. I love learning about him as a self educated guy. I guess he's one of those guys that kind of really. He seems like a very an intellectual uh, hero. He stood up for what he truly believed, and I'm curious maybe if we can put him in today's, what do you think some of the things that he would be saying, and then we can talk a little bit about his history and his legacy. But I think this is part of his legacy. What would he say in a crisis? It's not like he went through crises himself. What are some of the things that he would say about today?
It's pretty interesting because I think you have to look at, like, what would Mises's attitude be towards a public health disaster like this. What would he recommend? And I'm pretty sure I can say with confidence he would say, whatever the solution is, it's not going to be provided by lockdowns and big government. I mean, that's, there's plenty of problems in the world, but they're better solved by people and markets. Now, to my knowledge, I have really scoured Mises to try to find something in his works about um, how society deals with pathogens. And I can't find anything about it because it just wasn't an issue. But now he wrote Nation, State, and Economy in 1919. So he would have had knowledge of the 1918 pandemic. But, um, the government response to that was so sporadic and geographically isolated that it was not a problem he ever really dealt with. In 1922, he wrote a book called Socialism, which is a great book, um, in which he does have a section in there on health in general, and he said that everything government does to promote health actually promotes ill health. That it reduces people's will to stay healthy, and he makes the point that health is to a surprising extent a reflection of individual volition. It's whether you want to be healthy, whether you're um, taking care of yourself, kind of thing. And he said everything government does to intervene in the health sector actually promotes, subsidizes ill health. So that was his comment there. It wasn't about viruses in particular. Um, and actually, one of the real problems, and again, this goes back to the point I was making at the outset about crises in general. Um, the trick that the state wants to engage in is to find something to do that the population has very little experience with. Uh, after World War II, people didn't have experience with something like a communist state. They got scared. Or after 9/11, they didn't have experience with buildings being blown up by terrorists, and so people are willing to forego their fundamental rights when they think that there's an emergency. So they managed to turn this, what I think is a very normal pathogen, into a big disease panic, a primal medieval style disease panic, and it worked. So I think Mises would have been hip to it. It's really hard to say because he didn't speak to this issue at all.
Well,
No.
yeah, one of the things that you actually wrote in the book you edited, "The Best of Mises,"
Yeah.
which we'll put in the show notes. is you wrote this in the preface. The choice of freedom of control makes the difference between life of dignity and opportunity over degradation and suffering. In life and property, Mises identifies the crucial difference that capitalism made. It shifted the locus of control from the elites to the common person, thereby unleashing human creativity and massively raising living standards for everybody.
Right.
And I think that goes kind of to what your point is as far as, maybe he didn't speak specifically about pathogens and public health in that way, but certainly his principle was that the idea of capitalism, the idea of choice and dignity will always be a better solution than that of control and government.
Yeah, that's right. And the particular point about the elites is interesting because Mises really was a believer in the common person as the sort of the driving force of progress. And he believed that the great revolution of um, the rise of capitalism, I'm using all these terms with some trepidation because they all require definition, but um, um, modern capitalism was that it was a revolution in terms of um, marketing, that the elites were no longer solely in control of the world, but rather the common person could direct, how much to produce, what is produced, and at what price, and direct the development of technology. And he really believed that average people um, should be in charge, and that was the great, um, as far as he was concerned, the great political project from the ancient world. It's like, how do we have a kind of social order in which average people can exercise volition and control and experience social progress with a sense of equality and dignity? And to me, the answer there was a free commercial sector. That was the really revolutionary moment. Um, which is another reason I think he would have been appalled by coronavirus lockdowns, because they were nothing if not an elite racket. It was just the 1/3 of the workforce that could make their zoom their lives. Um, just hid in their homes and protect themselves from the pathogen while using the working class and poor as their sandbags. Get out there, get infected, create herd immunity for me. Let me know when it's safe. That was the ethos, and it was a disgusting ascendance of ruling class values over the poor and working classes, exactly as you expect with all forms of government planning.
Yeah, and I think that's the hidden price that we're it's hidden because so many of us, I feel very privileged. I'm don't consider myself an elite, but I have enough technology that I can do work remotely if I need to. We're doing this podcast remotely. I can do a lot of things and frankly not have a lot of contact with people if I don't want to. And that's just not reality for much of the world, especially the poor and those that are vulnerable. And yet it's the poor and vulnerable that the elites seem have to always profess as wanting to help, and it's really frustrating that it's exactly those people that is um, always being hurt the most. They're the forgotten man. They're the ones that completely pay the price for these draconian measures that we've been going under, and it's nothing new. I look at uh, uh, history, World War I, communism, all these big um, problems that or theories that people have about creating a utopia and a happy, great place, always seem to come down to a small elite governing the rest of us plebs, and it always ends up in disaster every time. And at some point, it'd be wonderful for people to remember that.
This has always been true, in particular with regard to disease. There are whole social systems that are structured around distinguishing between the clean and the unclean. The ruling class always wants to stay free of disease. There's a weird pathology on the part of the well-to-do that they imagine that they are deserving of more cleanliness, and they have a much greater degree of like what you call like germophobia than you'll find in other than in the working classes and the poor. Um, and it's just a mindset, and it's true in the ancient world. Uh, the cholera epidemics always took place outside the city, and everybody just hid from them. It was true in the deep south that the wealthy uh, slave owners, would the gentlefolk, would hide in their mansions, from yellow fever, and just let the slaves get it. And um, um, it's true in biblical times too. The diseased were never allowed anywhere in near the temple. And you had to go through a ritualistic cleansing to get in. So we have a long history of stratifying and segregating, um, creating feudal structures in the name of disease avoidance. We gradually got out of that in the Western world by the ascendance of the idea of individual rights and equality. And so suddenly it was like, okay, we're not going to restructure society in terms of pathogen avoidance. We're all going to share equally in the burden of dealing with the new pathogens. And the herd immunity is not something for one group to bear on their own, but that everybody bears it equally, with one exception, which is that the very vulnerable populations, which are almost always with these kinds of respiratory viruses, they're almost always the aged and infirm. And so, but the thing about the principle of age, and why we want to allow focused protection for the elderly, is that that's age is something that doesn't discriminate based on religion or race or language or social class. It's a principle of equality. So the elderly, we've always believed, we're entitled to uh, to isolate, and to avoid the pathogen, while the rest of society goes about its business and experiences exposure, and then bolstered and improved immune systems as a result. That's the benefit. So if you're not dying, then you're actually getting stronger, right? Um, and that was the principle that we used for a large part of the 20th century. It was a very modern. Actually, in the United States, we used that in the 19th century too. Yeah, except for the Deep South, where you had the stratified disease avoidance system. But for the most part, we just gradually came to the conclusion that we have a social contract that's associated with the presence of pathogens, which is that we don't impose the burden on people based on religion and race and class, but rather share it all equally, in exchange for which we get human rights and freedom. And that's the deal that we made. Implicit is kind of an evolved form of social contract, not anything you sign, but just something that you recognize, because we recognize that the alternative to this is actually despotism, segregation, and feudalism.
Yeah.
And with the lockdowns, we just decided to forget all those principles, and adopted a new principle, and it was grim.
Well,
And you see
I
the
think,
results.
yeah, I think you can't. I mean, we're talking about liberty and freedom. Like, you cannot take away the other side of the coin, which is risk, personal accountability, and danger. Those two are two of the same things, and it's about assessing the risk and making wise choices, and also um, taking maintaining a certain amount of faith from the standpoint of bad things are going to happen. Bad things may happen no matter what, and no no government or anybody else can protect you from bad things happening. And I think we live in a society now that is kind of trying to have his cake and eat it too, from a standpoint of like somehow we're going to be perfectly free and yet perfectly protected by somebody else, and all of our decisions are made. It's just an interesting idea that we this we can't get away from we can't uncouple those two ideas, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
A lot of people were willing to do it in this case because there's a widespread sense, dating from the second week of March or something like that, 2020, that this virus was something really unusual and really ferocious. It was like a plague. You couldn't see it. You don't know where it is, but it's probably everywhere, and it's probably going to kill you. This was the prevailing ethos, and so people were willing to give up everything, for this, um, without any evidence. Actually, it's not quite right. I mean, we had evidence from the Diamond Princess. Um, we had evidence at that point from nursing home deaths. We knew we had a lot of knowledge about the case fatality ratio of this particular thing, the population that was most vulnerable to it, and so we knew a tremendous amount of things, but we just decided to ignore all that, um, and just promote disease panic, and people just got consumed. I mean, God, when you think about the appalling behavior people engaged in, covering their bodies up with cellophane and denouncing people for touching their groceries and afraid to get their mail because I think it's just filled with virus. And the whole thing was just an incredible. There's
Well,
a
and
hell
I
of a time
still
to live through.
I still see people, I don't mind people wiping down counters and things, but that's not the point. The point is they're wiping down counters because they still seem to think like the virus is sitting there on the counter waiting for them to pick up.
Well, if you can't see it, then it could be anywhere, right? So you fill in your ignorance with your imagination, and and I mean, it is a reality that we're surrounded by germs. There's there are a billion times more germs than there are bodies in your cell, in your cells in your body. So I mean, germs are everywhere, and and that's why we evolved with immune systems to deal with it. And the more exposure we experience, the healthier we get, and the longer our lives, longer the lives we live. Like one of the things that um, thinkers in our tradition have neglected is um, the contribution that the rise of transportation and trade in the late 19th century and early part of the 20th century dramatically improved our immune systems by virtue of our exposure to a greater heterogeneity of pathogens.
Wow,
So
that's interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
so because people ask, well, how come we live till 79 now, but 100 years ago the average age of death was 56? Well, I mean that's a gigantic leap, and people say, well, it's because we have better doctors and we have gyms, or I don't know, people have all kinds of prosperity in general. We have cleaner water and so on. Um, yeah, there's some truth to that, but there's also a huge contribution that exposure has made to giving us longer lives. Our immune systems are weirdly scalable. I mean, like we evolved with astounding capacities for disease resistance, provided we are willing to experience exposure to the mild pathogen as a means by which we can avoid the more serious pathogen. But that's a little counterintuitive, but it made a huge difference in the immunological map of the Western world. It we have better immune systems now in prosperous countries around the world than have ever existed in the whole of humanity, ever. And that's why people live such a long time now. That's a major contributing factor is capitalism and trade that enabled that.
Well, because when you're trading with people, you're engaging with people, you're with people, and that goes back to your statement before about the necessity to keep us apart. Because once you do that, then there is only one method to keep you safe, and that's. And I saw something the other day where um, states are considering another mask mandate, another lockdown. As if we're going to eradicate disease completely. It's so hubris. It just drives me insane.
The Los Angeles case is a very interesting one because, tomorrow night at midnight goes in a new mask mandate. Um, and I was looking at the data this morning, and it's always I'm so tired of doing this, but every time I hear some big new government program to crush the virus, I look at the data, and cases are down 93% in Los Angeles County, like 93% down from its peak. Hospitalizations are rising, but they're rising relative to being almost flat. And deaths are as low as they've been. I mean, there's a good argument that all else equal, without migration and things, that there's plenty of herd immunity that's been obtained already, especially with the vaccinations that are just really high um, in that county. So why do they do it? And that's a very interesting question, because it's not obvious why. What they say is, well, their models demand that if you have such and such an increase of cases over a 7-day period, then we have to have masks. Not that there's any evidence at all, drawing a connection between the masking and the disease suppression. There's just not. I mean, there's quite a lot of evidence. How do you put it? There's no evidence that there's any kind of causal relationship there, but they do it anyway. And I just think at this point, what's driving policy is just public health officials who just have enjoyed the hell
Yeah.
out of their lives for the last year and a half, being doted on by the media, ordering everybody around. It's a real kick.
Yep.
You languish in obscurity your whole life. You've got a degree in public health, you've got a stupid bureaucratic position, you don't work, and you haven't. And then suddenly everybody's like, hey, what should we do? What should we do? Well, you should wear masks and you should distance. So it's kind of a cool thing. So
Well,
it's their moment in the sun.
it is. By the way, and it does remind me of kind of when Keynesian's ideas came really to the forefront in the early 1900s and the early 20th century, because it was, what it did is it gave government and officials an excuse to do the things they always wanted to do, without the repercussions of losing at the ballot box. All of a sudden you could spend all the money you want, and there's no repercussions. In fact, it's good for the economy if all we do is spend, and we can lock down all we want, and there's no repercussions because, hey, there's we have to protect ourselves from the disease. In other words, it gives sociopaths a reason to do the things they've always wanted to do, which is control people.
Um, yeah, I don't have anything to add to what you just said. I think that's exactly right, and that's the fundamental thing here. I think the lockdowns happened because people were enormously confused about immunology and epidemiology and public health. But once they happened, you suddenly, you were engaged in a huge social political experiment. Like, how much power can the state actually um, engage in? How much power can they actually deploy on the population? To what extent are people going to put up with it? How deep is this research? How deep is the reach of the state? Can we go into every home? Can we tell people how many people they can have in their homes? Can we shut the churches? I mean, you wouldn't think so, but they kept stepping it up and stepping it up and stepping it up. Let's shut the bars. Let's have restaurants at half capacity, and let's kick the kids out of school. Let's just see uh, the range of our power here. Let's deploy it. We can always roll it back later, but then we'll know. Well, they got the worst lesson in 2020 about just surely what was possible, and you've surely noticed this. It's no longer just about disease control. It really is about social and political management of the population. That's the driving ethos now. Uh, we've traveled so far from anything like a liberal spirit. It's actually terrifying, the extent to which illiberal ideology is unleashed on the world today in every sector of life, and in a way that's, I think, enormously shocking to those of us who have traditionally been very optimistic about the future of liberty. I always have been. And so to just wake up one day and the foundations of civilization itself had just crumbled beneath your feet is shocking. And I think at this point, what we're dealing with is that there's so much anger and fury in the public right now, all over the world. There's so much disgust, especially as people, discover that, the infection fatality rate for under 70 is, uh, 0.05 and so on. As people discover this is a normal pathogen, uh, it's like, well, why then do we do this? That led to 30% increase in drug overdose, 50% collapse in cancer screening. It's like, why do we give up all of our liberties for this? So right now, there's a strong attempt, and you'll see it alive in any government policy now, to to suppress information, because they need to do that. That's why Biden administration is directly controlling Facebook now. They have to suppress the distribution of information, and they have to um, intimidate people into not thinking for themselves, and to make sure that the angry masses aren't just going to revolt. So that's what we're in right now. It's a period of massive political control.
Well, and what do you think? Because one of the things that has bothered me, one of the shocking things that has been, I know there's a lot of anger out there, but it seems to be paper tiger anger, in my opinion. Like there's people complaining, and there's people, saying, "Oh, I can't believe," and yet there's so much compliance at the same time. I don't see. Um, and maybe I'm just in the wrong place, but I guess I wish I saw more of a resistance to um, you know to these draconian measures, to the idea that somehow the governor of a state or the president of the United States can just dictate whether somebody's going to knock on your door and see if you've had the vaccine or not.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of resistance out there. The problem is that it's having a hard time finding a way to express itself.
Ah, that's good. Yeah.
So you've got tremendous censorship right now, tremendous control of information flows. People are desperately right now looking for alternative platforms, and they're finding them. But all the mainstream venues, from Twitter to YouTube to your basic Google searches, are completely, designed to just push one message and call everything else misinformation, disinformation. It doesn't pass the fact checkers and that sort of thing. So there's a real attempt to control people in that way. And during the lockdowns, you know, it's really helpful. We used to have the um, right to redress and associate, and to get out and protest. But lockdowns were like, no, no, you have to stay home. You can't hang out with people. It's fine if you want to give somebody a Zoom call. That's okay. But you can't go out in the streets. That changed in the summer when finally the George Floyd protests happened. And it was a great, um, I would say, like, reason for people to finally get out of their homes and exercise some bravery. And that kind of temporarily broke the lockdowns. But then the ruling class said, okay, you've protested racism enough. Now you need to go back and hide and be afraid again. That time is
We
over
have
now.
this Delta variant you got to stay away from.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, whatever the newest thing is. I wish that I blame a lot of this on people's ignorance of immunology. Actually, like I think um, so. I mean, there's just several rules of thumb in epidemiology that we've known about for 100 years. That there's a whole generation that somehow didn't know about them. But one is you want exposure to the mild pathogen to protect you from the more serious pathogen. I mean, that's the way vaccines work, and that's how immune systems improved. The other one is that there's always a trade-off with these kinds of viruses, between prevalence and severity. So the more cases there are, the more infectious it is, the less likely it is to kill you. And that's just a kind of a principle of virus evolution. They're survivors. They don't want to kill their hosts. So the smart viruses spread and don't kill. And the more infectious something is, in the sense, the less deadly it is. I mean, that's just a sort of truism, but people forgot about that. Now, it's subject to certain conditions of latency and so on. But as a general principle, there is a inverse relationship between severity and prevalence, and so people forgot about that. Another one, it concerns these mutations and these variants. Viruses come with different features. So some are very stable, and so you can develop vaccines for them and treat them very well. And they don't mutate much. And a good example of that would be something like smallpox, right? And then on the other side, there's pathogens that are have large changes of clothes, big walk-in closets, and they're always changing their outfits every day. And they tend to be so they mutate a lot. So a good example of that would be malaria. There's no vaccine for malaria, because you can't stabilize it enough. Coronaviruses are somewhere in between, but one of the things for sure is that when a new pathogen comes along, the wild type is going to be the most severe, and then it's going to God, I hate to anthropomorphize viruses, but like if they had brains, right?
Uh-huh.
It would be like, okay, well that we had quite a go of it, but if we keep killing at this rate, we're never gonna we won't live. We've got to find new hosts and not kill them, so that we can jump to new hosts, and so we can kind of live in awesome places.
Right.
And so there's a number of strategies for doing this. One is to not kill the host. Another is to mutate insofar as that's possible. But every mutation becomes more prevalent and less severe. And so that is something you know, just because that's the way viruses are. That's what we've observed, and it's an evolutionary trait of pathogens. So when the variants came along, I mean, because I've read all this stuff, I knew for sure that the new variants would be less deadly than the wild type virus. And but Fauci's not going to tell you that. But I knew it just from reading the literature. And sure enough, it's just so tedious. And now, of course, over the last couple of weeks, there's all kinds of new studies saying, oh, it turns out the Delta variant's not as deadly as the wild type. It's like, no kidding, You could have known that. I don't want to say a priori, but you know that by virtue of what we learned over the 20th century. We just decided to forget it or ignore it or something.
Because what you're saying is new information to me, and I'm just thrilled to hear it, and I'm excited. And at the same time, I'm again kind of just like frustrated because that information, as you said, we have no education about immunology or how this stuff actually works, because all we're getting is propaganda. And I'm wondering, is there a good place for somebody like me, a layman, can learn about this stuff? I have and I'm honest, I'm asking this coldly because I don't know. Like,
Well,
where can we find out about this?
I've read like first year medical textbooks on viruses and immunology. I mean, over the last year, like I've read an incredible amount. The first book I read on the topic is called Cell Biology for Dummies. You can download it on Amazon. It's really good, but you don't have to do that. The best single text, and it's short and it's really evocative and brilliant, is by a theoretical epidemiologist at Oxford University named Sunetra Gupta. And you can download for free her book on Amazon. It's called Pandemics, Facts Not Fear. It's a terrible title. I don't like the title, and I want to republish it actually under a different title, because it's a kind of a theory it explains pathogens to you, and so you're not Like, we have a lot of knowledge of these things. So it's not like we felt in February and March of 2020, like, oh, there's a terrible thing happening. We have no idea what it is. Well, we've had vast experience with these things. And it's not the case that something completely unfamiliar and new is going to come along, like in the movie Contagion, for example. Did you ever see that movie?
I didn't. I can only imagine what it is, though.
Well, it's definitely worth watching, um, because it's a kind of a Hollywood template for what we just went through. I mean, it's got,
Okay.
you know, some guy eats a piece of pork in, some far-flung wet market of China or something, and then, touches a glass and it goes into somebody else, and then she travels to Chicago, and then suddenly she's
Okay.
hooking up with her boyfriend, and then he dies, and then she gets home, and then she dies, and then so it's this kind of wild. I think it had a case fatality rate of in the movie of like 30%. And there were some epidemiologists that consulted. Oh, and one of the reasons for the hysterical reaction towards hydrochloroquine, uh,
Yeah.
whatever that crazy drug was that in the movie there's a guy who's selling a cure, and he's like a blogger. It's such a funny movie. He's a blogger. He's selling a cure, and people are clamoring into the drugstores to get the thing, and he's like making bank, and everybody. So, it's got all the elements. That's hydroxychloroquine, I guess that's so. So if you've seen that movie, you would have said, "Oh, okay, here we get Trump promoting the fake therapeutic. That's exactly what we expect." But what's funny about the movie is that a 30% case fatality rate is unbelievably high, and it's funny how people die in the movie. They're just sitting there normally, and suddenly foam starts coming out of their mouth, and I mean, there's nothing about this that makes any sense with any experience we've ever had, ever.
Right.
And the trick in the movie for making this plausible, even slightly plausible, is that they built into this particular pathogen a long period of latency. So if you have a long period of latency, you can be carrying the virus. Like, I could get the virus in January and not know I have it until July.
Right.
Catch it in July, and suddenly, in December, I turn out to have black lungs or whatever.
And yet
So,
you're passing it along to everybody, I
yeah,
assume.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So latency is one of the factors that adds, I would say, like a complicating variable to the general principle concerning severity and prevalence. That if you don't know you have it, you can spread it for a very long time. This was the key to AIDS. It was the latency of AIDS that was so alarming, and that is the key to its being so deadly. So in the movie Contagion, they built into the virus this long latency period as a way of making it sort of more or less plausible, making it feel like the plague. The plague is, by the way, a bacterial infection.
Which is
So
what they talked about with Corona. They said, "Hey, we have this 2 weeks of I guess you call latency that we don't know if you have it or not. That you can be passing it along."
yeah,
That's
it's
what I
gotten
understood.
shorter and shorter. Initially, the 2 weeks was just a rule of thumb, but then it got reduced to 5, and then 3 days, and then over time it turns out this is basically has got the latency of a typical respiratory virus, which is it's like a cold. There are two kinds of colds. There's coronavirus colds, and there's rhinovirus colds, and so yeah, it behaves pretty much like a cold.
And by
And
the way, that takes me to another point that these elitists, but and it frustrates me. It's kind of like when there's a problem at the bank, it's always in the bank's favor. Like when you see these studies and they first come out, for some reason, there's going to be 2 million dead. It's going to take you can carry the thing for 6 months and not know that you have it. You can have, and then all of a sudden, it's like magic. It just as we learn more about it, it looks more and more and more normal. And yeah, at the beginning, it's like everybody thinks it's the end of the world, and there's absolutely no humility when it comes to stuff like this, and it drives me crazy.
well, this speaks to the point that John E. Needys made in an article for Stat News, and I think it was the second week of March. This article came out. He said, "We're making appalling decisions that are going to have shocking effects on civilization and public health without any real evidence to back them up." And he said, well, here's what we know. And he went through the Diamond Princess and everything. Basically, he argued this is a normal pathogen. And boy, was he demonized, just for his sheer scientific attitude. And there were oh God, what a time. The models that were predicting millions of dead and all these things that case fatality rates sorry, infection fatality rates of 3 and 4%. That was always assuming homogeneous risk across all population groups. The worst possible assumption you could ever build into any model is uh, homogeneity of risk. And yet that's what all the models did. And once you adjust the models for heterogeneity of risk, especially for the incredible age difference with this SARS-CoV-2, as compared, with pathogens of the past, which actually, the flu really affects young people a lot, actually, in ways in which this one does not. Um, uh, that assumption was never in the models. I mean, it was just, and once you adjust the models for the age disparities, what you get is a death rate about like what we have.
Yeah.
There's nothing particularly unusual about it. But once you start messing with the models and you start believing the models instead of your own eyes, uh, you've got a real problem. And that's true in every area, whether it's economics or public health or anything.
Mhm.
So one of the things you'll learn from watching the Birx press conference on March 16th is that everything she says, she keeps referring to the models. Our models tell us that if we social distance, then the virus will become less infectious. Our models tell us that um, you know, avoiding congregate settings, it has the biggest possible impact on community spread and so on. It was all about the models. So they believe the models rather than actual empirical experience. There's a real difference in a methodological issue, which speaks, this interview is about Mises. I mean, um, Mises always hated those kind of models that were unrealistic and, try to impose upon a complicated reality a very simple paradigm uh, that quite frequently mixes up cause and effect. Like one of the things he used to drive him crazy was referring to the elasticity of demand as if it was an independent, you know, number that somehow dictated to the world how the world was going to work rather than the reverse. That's a number you extract from existing experience, which is constantly mutating and changing and evolving, right? And so he really didn't like that mechanistic approach to economics because he was afraid it was going to tempt people to believe they can game the number or the model or the statistics and thereby cause reality to conform to it. And that's exactly what happened in the case of this virus. Fauci would write journalists in early March, and people would ask him, "What is the purpose of social distancing? Is it to wait for a vaccine?" And he wrote back, Michael Gerson of the Washington Post. He said, "No, that is not the point. We don't need a vaccine for this thing. What we need is to drive the R naught, which is the rate of infection spread, the rate of at which the infection spread, below 1, so that every one person gives the virus to less than one other person, and then that will cause the virus to then the R naught will eventually fall to 0 and we won't have a problem with the pathogen anymore." Well, that's a really interesting theory, but it really reverses cause and effect. I mean, this is like
Yeah.
saying the way to get it to stop raining is to take down your umbrella. I mean, it's a goofy view.
Right.
It's
If you
it's it's fundamentally fallacious.
if you take out your oil gauge, you'll never run out of oil. You know.
Yeah, it's a similar kind of thing. You're confusing the measurement with the cause,
Yeah.
and that's what happened with Fauci and the R naught. It's a consequence of over intellectualizing something and not recognizing the role of evolved complicated systems. And God, there's if you want to talk about anything that's involved and complicated, the world of pathogens and our human response to them is definitely that. And just resist module. These models tempt their architects and the people who are following them to believe that they have a level of control over the world that they just do not. And they it promotes a kind of arrogance, and then they
That's
kind of
true.
push it and push it and push it while refusing to recognizing that reality is not conforming to it, and that's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking to Jeffrey A. Tucker, and our time is short. And I just want to thank you again for your time, and also I want to thank you because I think we started out I started out wanting to talk about Mises and his influence, and I think what we've done is actually more important because we've talked about the ideas of liberalism, the ideas of freedom, and the importance of are making that very practical in what's going on today, and that's way more important than talking about theory or ideas. I think ideas are important in context, but I think, man, this is the crisis of today. The crisis of today is the effect of government due to a mysterious disease that isn't quite mysterious, due to putting fear on the people, and using any means necessary to drive that fear. So I want to thank you for doing that. I think this was an important interview.
Well, thank you so much for reading me, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to write and think about the topic. I hope that your listeners will take seriously the need to um, consider this topic very carefully and to come up with. Every person needs to come to terms with a new way to think about how you have a free society in the presence of infectious diseases. This is a really important topic, and we're just at the beginning of that. But we've got to rethink it and recapture that spirit of public health, the common good, equality, and individual rights and freedoms as the primary priorities for all social organization, regardless of whatever kind of emergency the ruling class has to pass off on you at any moment.
I couldn't end on a better statement. Thank you so much. We've been listening to Jeffrey A. Tucker. My name is Mike Levitt, and we are And If Love Remains.